gruesome true story of Portugal's first serial killer. Portugal has always been described as one of the safest countries in the world, but that was not the case in the late 18th century, when Diogo Alves murdered an estimated 70 people. He was sentenced to death by hanging in 1841, and his story remains one of the most horrifying cases in Portuguese history. So why would a seemingly innocent young man like Diogo Alves commit such gruesome crimes? How did he get away with murder for so long? And how did authorities eventually uncover what he had done? Who was Diogo Alves? A young man from Galicia, Spain, Diogo Alves left home when he was 19 years old to work in Lisbon, Portugal, where he worked as a servant for wealthy families. In time, after changing jobs, he began to drink and gamble, and he also had a lover, an innkeeper named Palhava Maria Gertrudes. Diogo was able to access the reservoir gallery called the Reserva das Aguas Amoreiras because of Palhava. She had keys to this area, which became known as the Aquedato das Aguas Livres. This was his preferred site to kill people. When he robbed his victims, Diogo blinded his prey, dragged them to the top of the aqueduct, and threw them off. It was a 65-meter drop, resulted in an instant death that earned Diogo the nickname the Aqueduct Murderer. His first nickname was Pacunda, which is Portuguese for blow, referring to an earlier incident in his life when he fell from a horse and hit his head. From 1836 to 1840, Alves killed over 70 people. He was a serial killer and robber from Spain. He was sentenced to death and hanged on February 19, 1841, along with an accomplice. His head was separated from his body so that his body could be studied and preserved for scientific research. Now, it is an attraction for tourists. His death mask is still on display at Lisbon's National Museum of Archaeology today. Alves remains one of the most infamous killers in Portuguese history. In 1974, a book about him titled The Man Who Killed Boys, The Life and Crimes of Diogo Alves was published. The crime scene. When Diogo killed his victims, he preferred to kill them at the Aqueduto das Aguas Livres, an 18-kilometer historic aqueduct in Lisbon. Construction on the aqueduct was started by the Portuguese King John V to provide drinking water to Lisbon. Under the direction of the Italian architect Antonio Cannavaro, construction began in 1731. In 1732, a group of Portuguese architects and engineers took over the project. It wasn't finished until 1748, but it started producing water to the city of Lisbon. An earthquake caused extensive damage to the property in 1755, but it still remains. This was his stomping ground to kill his victims. During this time, people were in the midst of an economic and political crisis. Many people were dealing with deaths and committing suicide because of their living conditions. Little did Diogo know that his time was coming to an end. Diogo was able to avoid detection because of how he killed his victims. He made them seem like they were committing suicide because of the economic downfall. How did his crimes come to light? Alves' crimes came to a light after the body of his first victim, Joaquina Sofia Gomes, was found in a field near Lisbon, and one of his victims managed to escape. There, they found blood-stained clothing and other evidence linking him to the crime. Alves confessed to killing Gomes, and led police to the bodies of his other victims and remaining women that were alive, Maria da Conceição, Antonia dos Anjos, and Manuela Neves. Some of the women had been strangled, and their bodies mutilated. Why do we still talk about him today? Despite the fact that it's been over 200 years since his last murder, the story of Portugal's first serial killer, Diogo Alves, still captivates people today. Why? Well, for one, his modus operandi was pretty gruesome. Alves would lure his victims, usually young men, into secluded areas with the promise of work or money. Once they were alone, he would attack them with a hammer, crushing their skulls. He would then strip their bodies naked and mutilate them before disposing of them in nearby wells or fields. All this from a man who started out as an orphan, living on the streets and begging for food. He began killing after he became a beggar. After one day when no one gave him any money, he murdered 2 boys by smashing their heads with a rock. What happened to him in the end? In the end, Alves was caught and tried for his crimes. He was sentenced to death and was hanged in public in 1841. His body was then taken to the city cemetery and buried in an unmarked grave. On the day of his execution, Alves refused to wear clothes in front of a large crowd who had gathered to watch him die. He died instantly after he was hung. Scientists removed his head to study his mind to try to figure out what made him commit these types of murders. Boy, the lengths they will do to try to figure out someone's mental issues. Makes you think. Don't forget to like, comment down below, and subscribe.